You're watching a video about humanity's darkest chapter. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from right now. Leave a comment with your location and the current time there. But first, take a moment. Turn off your notifications, dim the lights. This isn't the kind of video you watch while scrolling. This is the kind of video where you forget time exists, where hours pass like minutes, where the outside world simply fades away. So settle in, get comfortable, and remember, you're safe here. What you're about to hear is historical fact, nothing more. It's the story of how societies executed their criminals, their enemies, and their condemned across 3,000 years of recorded history. For thousands of years, execution wasn't just punishment. It was spectacle. It was theatre. It was something the entire community witnessed, sometimes for hours. The methods evolved not out of mercy, but out of a strange combination of practicality, cultural values, and the human need to innovate, even in the darkest pursuits. Some civilizations thought carefully about how to make death as slow as possible. Others thought about how to make it as quick as they could manage with the tools available to them. In all cases, execution methods tell us something profound about the societies that use them. We're going to journey through thousands of years together. We'll start with the ancient world, where empires executed thousands with methods that seem almost incomprehensible now. We'll move through the medieval period, when execution was a refined art form. We'll see how the Enlightenment changed everything about how societies thought of punishment. We'll witness the Industrial Revolution's strange contribution to the history of execution, and we'll arrive in the modern era, where most of the world has abandoned capital punishment entirely. This is a story about progress, about barbarity, about law, about culture, and about the constant struggle between justice and humanity. The ancient world didn't have prisons the way we do. You couldn't just house thousands of criminals indefinitely. So execution served a different purpose in society. It was often swift, often public, and often part of a larger system of control. Let's start somewhere very specific. Ancient China, around the 3rd century BC, during the reign of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China. Records from this period describe something called lingqi, which wouldn't become formalized for another 1,000 years, but the concept existed even then. The practice involved removing flesh from a condemned person in small pieces, sometimes over the course of many hours. The goal wasn't to kill quickly. The goal was to extend suffering to such a degree that it became almost philosophical. The condemned were given alcohol to keep them conscious. Their wounds were treated with oils to prevent premature death. It was only practiced on the most serious offenders, the worst criminals, those whose crimes were considered so heinous that normal execution wasn't sufficient punishment. The practice would continue in China for centuries and become more systematic and ritualized over time. But this wasn't unique to China. Ancient Rome had crucifixion, a method that would later become associated with Christianity, but was actually a standard Roman execution method for centuries before that. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they refined it. They studied how to make the process slower. They noticed that if you crucified someone in certain ways, death could take days. They noted that binding the hands was slower than nailing them, because the body would eventually slip down from binding and asphyxiate, but nails allowed the body to be supported longer. They recorded observations about which placement of the nail caused the most pain, which angles prevented movement most effectively, which positions made it hardest for the body to breathe. Crucifixion under Rome wasn't chaotic, it was methodical. Professional executioners understood the anatomy involved. They understood physics. They understood how to make death last. Some crucifixion victims hung for days before succumbing to exhaustion, shock, or asphyxiation. The spectacle was the point. Crucifixion didn't just kill the criminal. It sent a message to anyone watching that defying Rome came with a price so terrible that it would stay in their memory forever. Ancient Persia used a method called impalement, where a sharpened stake would be driven through the body. The placement was crucial. Too low and death came quickly. Too high or slightly off-centre, and death could take days. The condemned were sometimes left in the sun, exposed, until death occurred naturally. This wasn't a secret execution. This was public. Guards would sometimes sit with the impaled victim for hours, ensuring they stayed alive until the process had run its full course. The psychological effect on witnesses was exactly what was intended. Persia wanted would-be rebels to imagine themselves in that position. to imagine days of slow dying in front of crowds of people. Ancient Egypt also had sophisticated methods of execution. Pharaohs, whose bodies were considered sacred, were sometimes sentenced to what Egyptologists call damnatio memoriae, a condemnation where every image of them was destroyed, their name was erased from monuments and records, and their body was left unburied. For ancient Egyptians, who believed the afterlife was real and achievable only through proper burial, this was a fate worse than death. It was eternal erasure. The pharaoh would be executed, but their corpse would sometimes be left for animals, or thrown into the Nile, or scattered. The legal end of their existence was made to feel like the cosmic end of their existence. Their name, their face, their memory was forcibly removed from history by the state. In a civilization that valued immortality above almost anything, this was the ultimate punishment. The Carthaginians, rivals of Rome, had a different approach. They practiced what they called the pool of sharks, where certain criminals would be thrown into bodies of water populated with dangerous creatures. The exact nature of these creatures changed based on geography and what was available, but the principle remained. The condemned would be left in water with predators. Sometimes the predators would attack immediately. Sometimes the condemned would have to struggle for hours, knowing what was coming. Sometimes they would simply drown before the predators reached them. The Carthaginians believed this method was just because it was unpredictable. No two executions were identical. The condemned faced multiple possible deaths simultaneously, and they never knew which one would claim them. Moving forward in time to ancient Greece, we find something different. The Greeks had philosophies about justice and about appropriate punishment. One of the most famous cases is Socrates, executed in 399 BC, not by a violent method, but by poison. Socrates was forced to drink hemlock, a plant toxin that causes progressive paralysis. He sat with his students while he drank it, and then he waited to die. The process took hours. His body slowly became unable to move. His breathing became laboured. Eventually his respiratory system failed, and he died. This was considered a gentlemanly death, a philosophical death. The method was less about cruelty and more about maintaining dignity even in death. Socrates walked into his execution with his head held high. He drank the poison without resistance. He died in conversation with people he loved. To the Greeks, this was almost noble compared to the violent methods used in other societies. But ancient Greece also used other methods. The practice of ostracism, where a citizen could be voted out of the city-state entirely, was a form of social execution. You weren't killed, but you were forced to leave Athens forever. Sometimes this was considered merciful. Sometimes it was considered more terrible than death, because you had to live with the knowledge that your own city rejected you entirely. You'd have to start your life over in a foreign land, always an outsider. Ancient Egypt had a different method altogether. Criminals were sometimes sentenced to execution by being placed inside a sealed chamber with a poisonous creature. Asps were popular for this. The condemned would be locked in a stone room with the serpent. The window would be sealed. The outcome was never in doubt, but the specific means of death wasn't controlled. The asp might bite quickly. The asp might take its time. The condemned might die of fear before being bitten. The Egyptian philosophy was that if the gods wanted the prisoner to die that way, it would happen. There was a sense of fate involved, a sense that the method of death was in divine hands, not human hands. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations, execution methods are recorded in some of the oldest legal codes we know. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1754 BC, documents specific penalties for specific crimes. Some criminals were buried alive, some were drowned. Some had their hands cut off, or their eyes put out, or their tongues removed. These weren't capital punishments in the modern sense. These were permanent mutilations, ways of marking someone as criminal for their entire lives if they survived the procedure. The Code of Hammurabi was fascinated by proportional justice. An eye for an eye. If you struck someone and blinded them, your eye would be put out in return. But execution was reserved for the worst crimes. Stealing was sometimes punishable by slavery. Murder was sometimes punishable by execution. The specifics depended on the social status of the victim and perpetrator. A nobleman who murdered a slave might face lesser punishment than a slave who murdered a nobleman. The law was written, but it wasn't equal. The Minoans, the earlier civilization on Crete, used execution, but the specific methods are less well documented. What we know comes from religious art and burial practices. Sacrifices, which may have sometimes been criminal executions, seem to have involved drowning or being left in high places to die. The line between religious sacrifice and criminal execution was blurry in many ancient civilizations. A criminal could be executed as a sacrifice to appease a god. A religious ritual could become a legal punishment. Ancient Ethiopia had a practice called the Black Lion, where criminals would be put in a cage with a lion and left to whatever fate befell them. The beast might kill them instantly. It might toy with them. It might refuse to engage. The Ethiopian belief was similar to Egypt's. The gods were determining the outcome. Humans were just the instruments. In ancient India, the practice of nishkara was sometimes used. The condemned would have their limbs bound together and be left in a sealed chamber without food or water until they died. Depending on the season and the person's health, this could take anywhere from days to weeks. It was a method that required patience and a well-maintained system. The condemned couldn't accidentally kill themselves quickly. The chamber had to be sealed so securely that no escape was possible, no way to access food or water. It was execution through slow starvation, methodical and patient. The ancient Israelites had a system where certain crimes warranted death. Stoning was a common method. A crowd would gather, usually in a public space, and stones would be thrown at the condemned until they were dead. The community participated in the execution. This wasn't something done by a single executioner. This was collective punishment. Everyone who threw a stone bore a part of the responsibility. The philosophical idea was that the community's conscience was being expressed through the execution. If the entire community agreed the person deserved to die, then the community itself would carry out the death. The method meant everyone was complicit, and complicity in communal judgment was considered just. Let's move now into the medieval period. The feudal system created new kinds of social hierarchies, and with them came new methods of execution that reflected those hierarchies. In medieval Europe, execution became in many ways more systematized, less driven by immediate rage or moment-to-moment decisions, more integrated into the legal system. A nobleman would be executed differently than a peasant. A heretic would be executed differently than a criminal thief. One of the most common medieval execution methods was hanging. Hanging is simple. It requires a rope, a tree or structure, and gravity. But medieval executioners understood the mechanics of hanging in detail. If you drop someone too far, you break their neck and they die quickly. If you don't drop them far enough, they asphyxiate slowly. Some executioners were skilled enough to calculate the exact distance to break the neck cleanly. Some preferred the slow strangulation method. Hanging could be theatrical. The condemned would be brought in a cart to the gallows. The executioner would read the charges, the crowd would gather, and then the trapdoor would open and the body would fall. Sometimes the body would remain hanging for days as a warning. Families weren't always allowed to retrieve the body immediately. The body would decompose in public, and this decomposition was part of the punishment. It transformed the execution into something ongoing, something that didn't end when the heart stopped. But medieval Europe had methods far more elaborate and violent than hanging. The wheel, called the breaking wheel, was used across Europe for centuries. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel, usually horizontally. An executioner with a large iron hammer would then break the victim's bones limb by limb. The legs, the arms, the ribs, the spine. Each blow shattered bone. Each blow caused the wheel to rotate slightly. The process could take hours. The condemned would be left there, tied to the wheel, broken, bleeding and dying slowly. Some versions of the wheel execution were even more elaborate. The victim would be tied to the wheel, bones broken, and then the wheel would be raised on a tall pole so that birds would attack the body while the person was still alive and conscious. Death from the wheel was one of the slowest and most painful executions available. It was reserved for the worst criminals, those who had committed crimes so severe that the society wanted them to suffer as much as possible before death finally came. The garrote was another medieval method. The condemned would be seated, and a metal collar would be placed around their neck. As the executioner tightened the collar, it would close the airway. A screw mechanism made the tightening precise and controlled. The person would slowly asphyxiate. They'd be conscious the entire time, aware of exactly what was happening to their body as the air ran out and their lungs burned and their vision began to narrow. The garrote was often used as an execution method for nobility, because it was considered less violent than other methods. It didn't involve bleeding. It didn't require strength from the executioner. It was mechanical, controlled, and relatively clean. There was a theory among medieval elites that the garrote was more civilized than hanging or drawing and quartering. This notion of a civilized execution was important. It reflected class divisions. A nobleman wouldn't be subjected to the same methods as a peasant. A nobleman might be garroted. A peasant might be hanged. A slave or someone of extremely low status might be drawn and quartered. Drawing and quartering was one of the most extreme execution methods ever devised. It involved multiple stages. First, the condemned would be partially hanged but not allowed to die. They'd be taken down while still alive. Then they'd be castrated, and their intestines would be removed, usually while they were conscious. Then they'd be killed, usually beheaded. Then their body would be cut into 4 pieces. Then the head would be placed on a spike in a public location. The entire procedure took hours. It was deliberately divided into separate painful stages. Each stage had a specific meaning. The partial hanging meant they had faced death and survived it. The castration was about removing their ability to reproduce, symbolically erasing their bloodline. The disembowelment was literally removing their centre, their core. The beheading was finally the death. The quartering was the destruction of the body. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the absolute worst crimes. Treason, which was considered the worst crime possible, often resulted in drawing and quartering. If you betrayed the king or the state, this is what waited for you. The body would be positioned so that each piece was displayed in a different part of the city. Your head in one place, your torso in another, your limbs scattered throughout the kingdom. The point was that you wouldn't be buried whole. Your body would be dismembered forever. You couldn't achieve afterlife in most medieval Christian theology if your body wasn't buried intact. So drawing and quartering was about eternal punishment. It was punishment that extended beyond death. Burning was another medieval execution method, and it was particularly reserved for heretics and for witches in the later medieval and early modern periods. The condemned would be tied to a stake or placed in a barrel filled with pitch or tar. Fire would be lit. Death came from severe burns, from smoke inhalation, or sometimes from the person jumping from the fire before death to escape the pain. Burning was public. Crowds would gather to watch. Sometimes the fires were huge. Sometimes multiple people would be burned at once. Burning at the stake became particularly common in the 16th and 17th centuries during witch trials and religious persecutions. If you were accused of witchcraft, burning was often the sentence. If you were a heretic and refused to renounce your beliefs, burning awaited you. The connection between burning and spiritual purification was explicit in medieval and Renaissance thought. Fire was thought to burn away sin, to cleanse the body and soul, to punish through pain while also symbolically purifying society. Drowning was practiced in medieval Europe as well. Sometimes it was accidental, part of a river trial or a test of guilt or innocence. If you floated, you were guilty and would be executed. If you sank, you were innocent. But sometimes drowning was deliberate execution. The condemned would be tied into a sack and thrown into water, or they'd be locked in a barrel, or they'd simply be held under water until they stopped struggling. Drowning was often used for certain crimes. Women who committed crimes sometimes faced drowning rather than other methods. The reasoning wasn't about mercy. It was about the cultural feeling that certain methods were appropriate for certain crimes and certain genders. There was a strange code to medieval execution, an almost aesthetic sense that certain deaths were appropriate for certain offences. The Spanish had a method called the garrote vil, which was an evolution of the garrote. It was used through the 19th and into the 20th century in some cases. The condemned would be seated in a chair. A steel collar would be placed around their neck. When the lever was pulled, the collar would tighten, and the screw would push a metal spike into the spine. Death was nearly instantaneous, from the combination of asphyxiation and spinal trauma. The garrote vil was considered one of the quickest and most humane execution methods available at the time. Spain defended its use well into the modern era as a more civilized alternative to other methods of capital punishment. It didn't involve electricity, like the electric chair. It didn't involve poison, like lethal injection. It was mechanical, straightforward, and quick. The last execution by garrote vil in Spain occurred in 1974. Medieval executioners were often skilled craftspeople. They understood anatomy. They understood how to make death come in the way they wanted it to come. They were paid employees of the state, and they had apprentices who learned the trade. There was a whole profession of execution. A famous executioner in medieval Europe could attract crowds by their reputation alone. If a particularly skilled executioner was presiding over an execution, people would travel to see it. Some executioners were known for being merciful, for getting the work done quickly and painlessly. Others had reputations for cruelty, for making things last as long as possible. This reputation mattered. Some executioners were famous enough that their names were recorded in histories. They weren't hidden. They were known members of society. They had families, homes, and standing in their communities. Society needed executioners, and society created space for them, even while being horrified by their work. During the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe, specific crimes came to be associated with specific execution methods. Heresy was burning. Regicide or treason was drawing and quartering. Counterfeiting was sometimes boiling in oil or molten metal. The punishment fit the crime in a way that was both literal and symbolic. If you created false money, your punishment involved metal. If you betrayed the king, your body would be torn apart and scattered. There was an almost medieval logic to these associations. The punishment reflected and amplified the nature of the crime. Let's move into the 16th and 17th centuries, when execution methods began to include new technologies and new approaches. The European Renaissance brought with it new mechanical ideas, and executioners began to incorporate new tools and methods. The Halifax gibbet, which predated the French guillotine by centuries, was a mechanical execution device used in England. 2 wooden posts held a large weighted blade. The condemned would place their head under the blade, the rope would be cut, and the blade would fall, severing the head in one swift movement. The Halifax gibbet was used for centuries, and it worked on a simple principle that would later be refined in France. A heavy blade, gravity, a moment of mechanics, and death came instantly. The Halifax gibbet was popular because it was quick, because it was seemingly impartial, because it treated each condemned person the same way regardless of their status. The blade didn't discriminate. It fell the same way whether the condemned was a nobleman or a peasant. This sense of mechanical fairness appealed to Enlightenment thinking. The French later adopted and refined this concept, creating the guillotine during the French Revolution. The revolution came with the philosophy of equal treatment. All condemned people, regardless of class, would face the same method of execution. The guillotine was considered a democratic innovation. No one would suffer more or less based on their status. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, all would die the same way. The guillotine consisted of 2 tall wooden posts, a crossbeam at the top, and a weighted blade that fell from above. The condemned would kneel and place their head in the lunette, a wooden stock. The executioner would release the mechanism and the blade would fall. In the best cases, the head would be separated from the body almost instantaneously. Death would be immediate. In less ideal situations, the blade might become dull, or it might not fall cleanly, and the death might take longer. But the intention was always swift death. The guillotine became symbolic of the French Revolution. It was used to execute King Louis XVI in 1793. It was used to execute thousands during the Reign of Terror. It was used on countless prisoners. The guillotine was democratic in its cruelty. It didn't spare anyone. As the revolution became increasingly violent, the number of executions increased. The guillotine worked constantly. Executioners became public figures. The moment of execution became a public spectacle. Crowds would gather to watch the blade fall. Some people came out of curiosity. Some came out of civic duty, as a reminder of what the revolution meant. Some came because they enjoyed it. Executions became events. Vendors would sell food nearby. Musicians sometimes played. It was a public gathering, and the execution was the central point around which all other activity revolved. But the guillotine had a strange side effect. It made execution seem quick, and therefore painless. There was a debate that continued for centuries about whether the guillotine caused instant death, or whether the head remained conscious for a few seconds after separation. Some people argued that the severed head could see, could hear, could understand what had happened. Others argued that death was instantaneous. No scientific consensus was ever reached, and the question persisted into modern times. But the appearance of quickness made the guillotine seem progressive. It seemed humane compared to methods that took hours. Now let's consider execution methods in other parts of the world during this same period. In Japan, the samurai code included the practice of seppuku, sometimes called harakiri, which was a ritualized form of death by disembowelment. A samurai who had failed or committed a terrible crime could choose seppuku rather than allow an enemy to execute them. The samurai would sit in formal position, open their abdomen with a sharp blade, and cut across and upward. A trusted assistant called a kaishakunin would stand behind and attempt to sever the head with a sword, causing swift death. Seppuku was not execution in the traditional sense. It was closer to ritual death, to a way of taking control of one's own end rather than being subjected to an enemy's method. But it was sometimes imposed as punishment. A samurai could be ordered to perform seppuku as punishment for serious crimes or failures. The ritual aspect made it different from other execution methods. It involved ceremony, witnesses, specific positioning, specific clothing, specific timing. The samurai chose the moment of their death. They could make a final statement. They could face their death with dignity and control. Seppuku continued as a practice in Japan for centuries, and formal cases of seppuku continued into modern times. In Persia during this period, execution methods evolved but remained elaborate. The practice of impalement continued, but so did other methods. Persians used throwing from great heights. The condemned would be taken to the top of a tower or cliff and thrown off. Persians also used the practice of sinking into mud, where the condemned would be buried slowly in increasingly deep mud, with their head covered last. This execution method was particularly associated with crimes against the state or crimes of apostasy. The symbolism was that the person would literally be removed from the world, sunk out of sight, erased. In Ottoman Turkey, execution methods were often brutal and often prolonged. The Ottoman Empire used impalement as a primary execution method for centuries. The practice was refined and documented. Stakes were specifically designed to maximize suffering and extend death as long as possible. Some stakes were positioned to penetrate non-vital organs, ensuring hours of dying. The Ottoman Empire also used the method of tying the condemned between two horses or between ropes tied to horses, and then driving the horses in opposite directions, thereby tearing the body apart. This method was reserved for the worst crimes. It was public, it was slow, it was theatrical. The Ottoman Empire maintained this method for centuries, and it was one of the last major empires to use it before evolving to other methods in more recent times. In the Islamic world generally, execution methods were often prescribed by religious law. Beheading was a common method, believed to be relatively quick and therefore acceptable by Islamic law. Stoning, as inherited from earlier traditions, was also practiced. The method of death depended on the crime and on the specific interpretation of Islamic law by the particular state or community. In some cases, execution by burning was considered appropriate for certain crimes. In others, execution by a weapon was preferred. The religious framework meant that execution wasn't arbitrary. It was part of a system of law that was believed to be divinely inspired. Moving now into the 18th and 19th centuries, we encounter new technologies and new ideas about execution. The period of Enlightenment in Europe brought with it new philosophies about punishment. Some people began to argue that execution should be humane, should be quick, should minimize suffering. This was considered a progressive position. Rather than making execution slow and painful, enlightened thinkers argued that execution should be swift. This paradoxically led to the development of new technologies designed to kill as quickly as possible. If you believed that death was necessary for certain crimes, and you believed that death should be quick, then you needed to develop the most efficient method possible. It was in this context that the guillotine was truly championed. It wasn't seen as barbaric at the time. It was seen as progressive. It was humanitarian. It was efficient and equal. The Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin championed it, though he didn't invent it. The machine was actually designed by others, but guillotine's advocacy made it famous. The guillotine represented the best of Enlightenment thinking about execution. It was mechanical. It was reliable. It treated everyone equally. It was quick. To advocates at the time, it was the most humane way to execute someone because it minimized suffering, while still allowing the state to carry out the death penalty. In the United States during the same period, execution methods varied by state and region. Hanging was most common. But in 1890, New York became the first state to officially adopt electrocution as a method of execution. The electric chair was invented by Thomas Edison and was seen as a scientific and technological advancement. Electricity was new, powerful, mysterious to most people. The idea was that a surge of electricity through the body would kill instantly and painlessly. The condemned would be strapped to a wooden chair. Electrodes would be attached to the head and leg. Thousands of volts would surge through the body. Death would come in an instant. The electric chair was considered progressive. It was considered scientific. It was considered humane. The first execution by electric chair in New York took place in 1890. Many other American states adopted the method over the following decades. The electric chair remained in use in the United States well into the 20th century. But the electric chair had problems. Sometimes the electricity didn't kill as instantly as expected. Sometimes there would be bleeding. Sometimes the person would need multiple shocks. Sometimes smoke would come from their body. What was supposed to be a quick scientific death sometimes turned into something messier. Eyewitnesses to electric chair executions sometimes reported that the condemned's body would smoke, that their skin would redden, that they would strain against the restraints, indicating that the death wasn't as instantaneous as intended. Still, many American states believed in the electric chair and used it. Gas chambers were developed in the 1920s as another execution method. The condemned would be placed in an airtight chamber. Cyanide would be introduced. The person would inhale the poisonous gas. Death would supposedly come within minutes. The gas chamber was considered an advancement. It was clinical. It was clean. It didn't involve electricity or the uncertainty of previous methods. The condemned would breathe poisoned air and die. California adopted the gas chamber in 1938 and used it for executions through the late 20th century. Other states followed. The gas chamber was supposed to be humane, but like the electric chair, it didn't always work as intended. Sometimes prisoners died quickly. Sometimes they gasped and struggled for longer periods. Some death penalty abolitionists used the failures and the suffering of gas chamber executions as evidence that capital punishment was inherently cruel. In Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, the guillotine remained the primary execution method. It was used in France continuously. It was adopted in other countries. Germany used it. Belgium used it. Scandinavia used it. The guillotine seemed to represent modernity, efficiency, and scientific execution. It was used for political prisoners, for criminals, for revolutionaries. As time went on and as societies changed, the guillotine became more controversial. But it remained the primary method of execution in countries that continued to use capital punishment. Let's examine some particularly notable cases from this era. In France, the executions during the Reign of Terror in the 1790s created a kind of execution frenzy. Thousands of people were executed, many by guillotine, sometimes multiple executions in a single day. The sheer volume of executions became almost an industry. Executioners worked frequently. Crowds gathered regularly. The guillotine became a symbol of revolutionary justice, but also of revolutionary brutality. By the end of the Terror, many people, even those who had supported the revolution, began to feel that the executions had gone too far. The execution of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, by guillotine in 1793 was particularly shocking to European royalists. The Queen, the wife of King Louis XVI, was executed the same way as common criminals. The symbolic meaning was powerful. No one was above the guillotine. Even the highest nobility would be treated the same as everyone else. But the Reign of Terror also showed something else. It showed that societies could become addicted to execution. Once a regular practice of executions began, it became harder to stop. Each execution was justified by the need to protect the revolution, to eliminate enemies, to maintain order. But the definition of enemy expanded. Political opponents, people who simply disagreed with the government, people who had done nothing but existed in the wrong social class, all could be executed. The French Revolution killed tens of thousands of people through legal execution, and the process shocked Europe. In Russia in the 19th century, execution methods evolved as different governments came to power. Under the Tsars, execution was sometimes by firing squad, sometimes by hanging, sometimes by axe. The Russian Empire experimented with different methods. Exile to Siberia was often combined with or considered as an alternative to execution. Some revolutionaries and political prisoners were executed. Others were exiled. The uncertainty about which fate awaited them was part of the punishment. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by revolutionaries. In response, the government executed or exiled participants in the assassination attempt. The crackdown on revolutionary movements led to more executions. The cycle of violence and execution and revolutionary retaliation continued through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. In Asia, execution methods continued to evolve as well. China remained the most populous state, and Chinese execution methods were sometimes more elaborate than those in Europe. Lingqi, the slow removal of flesh, continued to be practiced for the most serious crimes through the 18th century. The practice was formalized and documented. There were specific techniques, specific sequences, specific ways of prolonging the process. The victim was given alcohol to maintain consciousness. The wounds were treated to prevent shock or premature death. Officials would observe the process. It was considered a particularly refined form of punishment for particularly heinous crimes. The practice eventually fell out of favor, and China officially banned Lingqi in the early 20th century. But throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, it remained a legal execution method for specific crimes. Japan maintained its own execution practices through this period. Seppuku continued as an option for samurai who faced execution. But common criminals were sometimes executed by crucifixion, by beheading, by strangulation. Japan had a refined system of law, and the method of execution was prescribed based on the crime. As Japan modernized in the late 19th century and into the 20th, execution methods evolved. Japan adopted Western methods like hanging, but Japan also maintained traditional methods longer than many other countries. In the Ottoman Empire, which controlled vast territories through the 18th and 19th centuries, execution remained brutal and elaborate. The method of tying the condemned between horses remained in use in some places and times. Impalement continued in some regions. As the Ottoman Empire began to decline, and as Western influence increased, execution methods began to evolve. Some Ottoman provinces and then eventually the Ottoman state itself moved toward more Western-style executions. But the transition was gradual, and in some places traditional methods persisted longer than in others. Now let's move into the 20th century, a period when execution methods in developed nations began to move away from public spectacle and towards something more private and technological. The 20th century was also a period of enormous violence, genocide, and systematic killing. But we're focused specifically on legal execution methods, not on murders or mass killings. The United States in the 20th century used several primary execution methods depending on the state. Hanging remained common in some states. The electric chair continued in some states, particularly in the Northeast. The gas chamber was used in Western states. Some states used firing squads. The method sometimes depended on the seriousness of the crime. A federal execution might be by one method, a state execution by another. There was no national standard. Each state had its own protocols. This led to significant variation. Two people executed for essentially the same crime might die by completely different methods, depending on which state they were in. Hanging remained a primary method in many American states through much of the 20th century. Professional executioners were employed by states. There was still expertise involved. The length of the drop had to be calculated based on the condemned's weight. Too short a drop meant a slow death by asphyxiation. Too long a drop meant a broken neck. The ideal was a drop just long enough to break the neck and cause instant death, but not so long that the head would be severed from the body. Some executioners were quite skilled at this calculation. Some were not. Some people hung took a long time to die. Others died nearly instantly. The last execution by hanging in the United States occurred in 1996 in Delaware. By that time, hanging was considered archaic, even though it had been used for centuries. The death penalty was becoming controversial in many places. Some people argued that no execution method was truly humane, that the attempt to find a painless way to kill someone was fundamentally contradictory. You can't humanely execute someone because execution itself isn't humane. This argument slowly gained traction in the 20th century, particularly in Europe, where many countries moved away from capital punishment entirely. The last execution in France by guillotine occurred in 1977. By the 1980s, France abolished capital punishment entirely. Germany had abolished it after World War II. Italy abolished it in 1948. Gradually, European nations moved away from the death penalty, but the United States continued to execute people. In the 1970s, a Supreme Court decision temporarily halted executions while the courts considered whether capital punishment was constitutional. Some death penalty abolitionists hoped this would lead to the abolition of capital punishment. But after several years, executions resumed. The first execution after the reinstatement of capital punishment in the United States was by firing squad in 1977. Gary Gilmore, a convicted murderer, was executed by a team of marksmen who fired simultaneously at his chest. The firing squad method was chosen by Gilmore himself. In the United States, condemned prisoners often had some say in the method of their execution. Gilmore chose firing squad. He was executed in Utah. The firing squad method, while controversial, had a historical precedent. It had been used for military executions and for certain criminals in various places. The idea was that multiple marksmen would shoot simultaneously, so no single person would know if they fired the fatal shot. This was supposed to distribute moral responsibility. No one person killed the condemned. The group did. After the reinstatement of executions, the United States began to look for more reliable methods. The electric chair had proven unpredictable. The gas chamber had proven unpredictable. Hanging could go wrong. Firing squads, while effective, were controversial because they were seen as too violent. Some states began to consider chemical execution. The idea was to use drugs to kill the condemned. It seemed more humane, more scientific, more civilized than other methods. In the 1970s and 1980s, states developed protocols for lethal injection. The basic idea was to use a combination of drugs. First, an anesthetic would be administered to render the person unconscious. Then, a drug would be administered to stop the heart. Then, another drug would be administered to stop respiration. Death would supposedly come quietly and painlessly. The condemned would simply go to sleep and never wake up. Lethal injection was adopted by several states. Oklahoma became the first state to execute someone by lethal injection in 1977. But the method was not always carried out as intended. Prison staff administering the injections often had no medical training. The drugs didn't always work as planned. Veins were missed. The anesthetic didn't always render the person unconscious. Some executions by lethal injection appeared to be problematic. The condemned would be awake and aware of what was happening. Some appeared to be gasping or struggling. Some appeared to take a very long time to die. Witnesses reported that the process looked painful and distressing. Death penalty abolitionists used these failures as evidence that lethal injection was not humane, and that the attempt to find a humane execution method was doomed to fail. By the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, lethal injection had become the primary execution method in most American states that still practiced capital punishment. Some states maintained alternative methods for condemned prisoners to choose. Oklahoma allowed firing squad if lethal injection was deemed unsuitable. Some states allowed gas chamber. A few states maintained electric chair as an option. But lethal injection was the default, the standard, the method most commonly used. Concerns about the method persisted. Lawyers for condemned prisoners argued that lethal injection violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Courts sometimes agreed that procedures needed to be improved, but executions by lethal injection continued. Outside the United States, other countries had different experiences with execution methods. In the Soviet Union, after the revolution, execution methods evolved. The Soviets used firing squads for political prisoners and serious criminals. The method was efficient and quick. It didn't require the same infrastructure as the electric chair or gas chamber. A few marksmen and a bullet were all that was needed. The Soviets executed thousands of people during the Stalin era, though the exact numbers are debated. Purges killed untold numbers. But as for legal executions of convicted criminals, firing squads were the primary method. The Soviet Union maintained capital punishment through much of the 20th century. It wasn't until after the fall of the Soviet Union that Russia moved toward abolishing capital punishment. Russia still technically has capital punishment on the books, but execution has been suspended since 1996. China maintained capital punishment throughout the 20th century. As China modernized, execution methods evolved from traditional methods like lynching to more modern methods. Firing squads became common. Later, China adopted lethal injection. China executes people at a rate higher than most other countries, though exact numbers are not always publicly disclosed. The methods evolved as technology became available, but capital punishment remained a common punishment for serious crimes like murder or drug trafficking. China views capital punishment as a necessary part of its legal system. This remains the case today, though there has been some movement toward reducing the number of executions and toward focusing capital punishment on the most serious crimes. Japan also continued to execute people throughout the 20th century. As Japan modernized, execution methods evolved. Hanging became the primary method. Japan executed political prisoners during World War II. After the war, Japan continued to execute criminals by hanging. Japan maintained capital punishment through the 20th century and into the 21st. Executions in Japan are typically conducted by hanging. The number of executions in Japan is relatively small compared to larger countries, but executions do continue. There is cultural support in Japan for capital punishment for the most serious crimes, particularly murder. In the Middle East, execution methods were often prescribed by religious law. Countries that applied strict Islamic law used methods like beheading or stoning. Saudi Arabia, for example, executed many people by beheading with a sword. The method was considered appropriate under Islamic law. Public executions by beheading were common in Saudi Arabia through much of the 20th century and into the 21st. Other Middle Eastern countries had different approaches. Iran used hanging, firing squads, and stoning as execution methods. These countries maintained capital punishment as a core part of their legal systems. International pressure to abolish capital punishment in many cases had limited effect. The legal, religious and cultural frameworks in these countries supported capital punishment. In Africa, execution methods varied by country. South Africa under apartheid used hanging as the primary execution method. South Africa executed thousands of people, many of them political prisoners or people opposed to apartheid. After apartheid ended, South Africa abolished capital punishment. Other African countries had different approaches. Some abolished capital punishment, others maintained it, using methods like firing squads or hanging. The adoption and abandonment of capital punishment in Africa often correlated with political changes, with the influence of international human rights organizations, and with specific incidents that sparked debate about the appropriateness of execution. Let's now examine some particularly notable execution cases from the 20th century that illustrate how methods and attitudes evolved. The execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953 in the United States was by electric chair. The Rosenbergs had been convicted of espionage for allegedly passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Their trial was controversial. Many people believed they were guilty. Others believed they were victims of Cold War hysteria. Ethel Rosenberg in particular was controversial to execute because she was a woman and a mother. The electric chair was used to execute both of them. The method had become standard in New York. The Rosenberg execution was widely publicized. It was seen by some as necessary national security, by others as an unjust killing of a woman. The case highlighted the political dimensions of capital punishment. The death penalty wasn't just about individual crimes. It was about social values, about political systems, about what society wanted to punish most severely. The execution of Carol Chessman in California in 1960 was by gas chamber. Chessman had been convicted of crimes including kidnapping and assault. He spent 12 years on death row. His case attracted international attention. There were appeals and stays of execution. Some people believed he was guilty and deserved to die. Others believed he was innocent. There were international efforts to prevent his execution. The Pope intervened. Foreign governments made requests for clemency. But ultimately, Chessman was executed by gas chamber. His death highlighted international opposition to capital punishment. Most other developed countries had abolished it or moved away from it. The fact that the United States continued to execute people made many other countries view the United States as barbaric. The execution of Carol Chessman occurred in a stadium-like room. Witnesses watched through glass. The cyanide was released. He died within minutes. His execution was one of the last in California for a period of time. A temporary moratorium on executions followed legal challenges to the gas chamber process. In the Soviet Union, the case of Dmitry Shostakovich's nephew was somewhat less famous, but highlighted the political use of execution. Young people executed for supposed crimes against the state often had executions that were kept secret from the public. No spectacle, no announcement, just death. This was very different from public executions. The Soviet system used execution as a tool of political control, often without transparency. Let's move now into discussions of specific execution methods and their mechanics in more detail, examining how executioners actually perform their work. The physics of hanging is straightforward, but required expertise. If the condemned's weight was calculated correctly, and if the rope was placed correctly at the neck, and if the drop distance was appropriate, then the fall would jerk the head downward. The sudden tension on the neck would dislocate the cervical vertebrae, causing immediate death. The spinal cord would be severed. Death would be instantaneous, or nearly so. But if the calculation was off, if the drop wasn't quite long enough, then the person would simply hang and asphyxiate slowly. Their consciousness would fade gradually as oxygen was cut off from their brain. The process could take minutes. Some sources suggest up to 50 minutes or longer. During this time, the condemned would be conscious, aware of what was happening, unable to do anything about it. Their face would darken. Their muscles would twitch. The struggle might be unconscious, automatic reactions to asphyxiation, but it would look like the condemned was suffering. Professional executioners knew how to calculate the correct drop distance to minimize this. They kept records. They studied the relationship between weight and drop distance. They refined their technique over time. But not every execution was carried out by a professional. Some were carried out by whoever the local authority appointed. These inexperienced executioners sometimes got the calculation wrong, and the result was a slower, more visible death. The electric chair operated on different principles. A surge of electricity was supposed to cause immediate death through cardiac arrest. The chair consisted of a wooden seat with attached electrodes. The condemned would sit in the chair. Their wrists and ankles would be strapped down. An electrode would be attached to the scalp. Another would be attached to one leg. When the switch was pulled, thousands of volts would surge through the body. The intention was that this surge would stop the heart. Death would come in seconds. But electricity doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the surge wouldn't be sufficient. Sometimes the placement of the electrodes meant the current didn't flow correctly. Sometimes the condemned's body would resist the current. Executioners operating the electric chair had protocols and sometimes had to administer multiple shocks. The first shock might not kill. A second or third might be necessary. The condemned's body could be visibly burned. Witnesses reported smoke, smells of burning skin, and other signs of extreme suffering. This contradicted the idea that the electric chair was a quick and painless method. The gas chamber operated by introducing cyanide gas into an airtight room. The condemned would be restrained in a chair. Cyanide pellets would be dropped into a container of liquid. The chemical reaction would produce cyanide gas. The condemned would breathe this gas. Death would come from asphyxiation and cellular damage. The idea was that the process would be painless, that the condemned would simply lose consciousness and die. But the actual process was sometimes different. Some condemned prisoners gasped heavily. Some appeared to struggle. Some took longer to die than expected. Some witnesses reported that the process looked painful. Some questioned whether the condemned were truly unconscious or whether they were aware of their asphyxiation. The gas chamber method fell out of favour partly because of these concerns. The appearance of suffering contradicted the rationale for using the method. The guillotine, as noted earlier, was supposed to cause instant death by severing the head from the body. In the best cases, it worked as intended. The blade would fall cleanly. The head would separate from the body almost instantaneously. Death would be certain and immediate, but the guillotine could malfunction. A dull blade would require multiple attempts. The head might not separate cleanly. There were cases where the guillotine malfunctioned, and the condemned had to be subjected to multiple drops before death occurred. This was theoretically disturbing to many people. The idea that the most modern and humane execution method could fail and cause suffering troubled many observers. Still, many people believed that the guillotine, when it worked properly, was one of the quickest ways to die. The beheading itself, if it happened in a single instant, would cause immediate cessation of consciousness. You couldn't feel pain if your brain wasn't receiving blood. The guillotine, at its best, was theoretically quick. Let's now consider how attitudes toward capital punishment evolved through the 20th century and into the 21st. In many European countries, capital punishment was abolished or abandoned gradually. Public opinion shifted. Human rights organizations formed and began to argue against capital punishment. There was an emerging belief that the state shouldn't kill people, even for serious crimes. The development of life imprisonment as an alternative to death meant that society could incapacitate the most dangerous criminals without executing them. Prisons could hold people indefinitely. There was no longer a practical need for capital punishment. The arguments became more philosophical and moral. Should the state have the power to take life? Should society maintain capital punishment even if it wasn't absolutely necessary? These questions led many countries to abolish capital punishment. European countries abolished capital punishment in phases. France abolished it in 1981, after centuries of using the guillotine. Germany abolished it after World War II. Italy, Spain, Portugal, and others followed. By the end of the 20th century, most of Europe had abolished capital punishment. The European Union made abolition of capital punishment a condition for membership. Any country wanting to join the EU had to abolish capital punishment. This created a strong incentive for Eastern European countries to abandon the death penalty as they sought to join the EU after the end of the Cold War. By the early 2000s, capital punishment was effectively abolished across Europe. This created a stark contrast with the United States. While most of Europe had abandoned capital punishment, the United States continued to execute people. The United States was grouped with countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and others as a state that regularly executed people. This became a point of criticism from human rights organizations and from many other countries. The United States was seen as having not progressed as far in its thinking about human rights and criminal justice as Europe had. From the European perspective, capital punishment was barbaric, a remnant of a less enlightened time. From the American perspective, particularly from the perspective of conservative states, capital punishment was an appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes. The disagreement reflected different philosophies about the role of the state, about punishment, about human rights. In some cases, international pressure led to changes. Some countries responded to criticism and moved toward abolishing capital punishment. Other countries resisted international pressure and maintained capital punishment. China and Saudi Arabia continued to execute large numbers of people despite international criticism. Iran continued to execute people. Japan maintained capital punishment despite being an otherwise modern, developed nation. Singapore maintains capital punishment for drug trafficking and other serious crimes. These countries viewed capital punishment as part of their legal and cultural systems, and international criticism didn't change their practices. Throughout all of this, there were interesting developments in how execution methods were chosen and defended. If a country used a particular method, officials would typically argue that it was humane, that it minimized suffering, that it was appropriate for a civilized society. Each method was defended as progressive at the time it was introduced. The guillotine was progressive, the electric chair was progressive, the gas chamber was progressive, lethal injection was progressive. Each new method was supposed to be an improvement over what came before, more scientific, more reliable, more humane. But each method had problems when actually implemented. Each method sometimes caused suffering. The idea that execution could be made humane, that you could find a method that was truly painless and respectful, proved elusive. Let's now examine execution methods in specific countries in more detail. In China, as noted, execution methods evolved over time. Traditionally, methods like lynching were used for the most serious crimes. As China modernized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, traditional methods were abandoned. The Chinese government adopted firing squad as the primary execution method. This was viewed as more modern, more consistent with a progressive state. Firing squads could be administered by military or police personnel. The method was efficient and quick. Multiple shooters meant no single person bore the full responsibility for the death. After the Communist Revolution in 1949, China maintained capital punishment as part of its legal system. The method remained firing squad in most cases. In the late 20th century, as China modernized further and developed pharmaceutical capabilities, lethal injection was adopted. China began to use lethal injection for executions. The method was more controlled than firing squad. It was seen as more scientific. It could be performed in a medical setting rather than in a public space. The transition from firing squad to lethal injection reflected China's continued modernization. The number of executions in China is difficult to verify because the Chinese government doesn't release comprehensive statistics, but estimates suggest that China executes thousands of people annually, far more than any other country in the world. The crimes that warrant capital punishment in China include murder, but also drug trafficking, armed robbery, and other crimes. This is broader than in many Western countries, where capital punishment is typically reserved only for the most serious crimes. The Chinese legal system views capital punishment as appropriate for serious crimes that threaten social order. The methods have become more medicalized over time, reflecting the development of modern pharmaceutical capabilities. In Saudi Arabia, execution methods remain traditional. Beheading by sword was and remains the primary execution method. The condemned is typically blindfolded. The executioner, usually a trained professional, uses a large sword to sever the head from the body. Death is usually instantaneous. The method is considered appropriate under Islamic law, which permits execution by the sword. Saudi Arabia executes dozens of people annually, sometimes for murder, sometimes for crimes like drug trafficking or apostasy, sometimes for crimes like witchcraft. The method hasn't changed much over time. The technology is simple. A skilled executioner can perform the execution efficiently. There have been efforts by human rights organizations to encourage Saudi Arabia to abandon capital punishment or to switch to other methods, but Saudi Arabia has resisted. The country views capital punishment as appropriate and the sword method as legitimate. In Iran, execution methods have varied. Hanging was the primary method for much of the late 20th century and into the 21st, but Iran also uses firing squad and in some cases other methods. Stoning was used in some cases, though it became less common. Iran executes dozens to hundreds of people annually. The crimes warranting execution include murder, crimes against the state, drug trafficking, and sexual crimes. The numbers and methods have varied by time period and by region within Iran. Executions in Iran are sometimes public, sometimes private. Some are conducted in prisons, some are conducted in public spaces. The visibility of execution depends on the circumstances and the decisions of authorities. In India, capital punishment was maintained as part of the legal system after independence from Britain. Hanging became the primary execution method. The condemned would be executed in prison, usually early in the morning. The method was relatively quick, and professional executioners were employed. India continues to maintain capital punishment, though executions have become rarer. In recent decades, India has executed relatively few people. Many states within India have moved toward opposing capital punishment, but at the federal level, capital punishment remains legal for the most serious crimes, particularly murder. When executions do occur, hanging remains the method used. In Japan, hanging remains the primary execution method. Japan executes convicted murderers. The condemned are typically executed in prison. Executions in Japan are often kept relatively quiet. The public is not always notified in advance. The condemned are hanged by professional executioners. The method is efficient. Death comes quickly. Japan has executed relatively small numbers of people compared to other countries, but executions do continue. There is public support in Japan for capital punishment in extreme cases. When horrific murders occur and the perpetrator is convicted, public opinion often supports execution. The legal system reflects this. Death sentences are handed down and executions are carried out. In the United States, as noted, execution methods have varied by state and by time period. By the early 21st century, lethal injection had become the dominant method in states that practiced capital punishment. But challenges to lethal injection, based on concerns that it violated the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, led to legal battles. Some states sought to return to older methods. Oklahoma considered returning to firing squad if lethal injection was deemed unconstitutional. Some states maintained alternative methods. Texas, which executes more people than any other state, used lethal injection. A few other states were executing people, but the total number of executions in the United States had declined from its peak in the 1990s. By the 2000s, executions in the United States were becoming less common, but they continued. Some of the notable cases involved convictions that were later questioned. DNA evidence sometimes exonerated people on death row. This raised questions about whether the system was reliable enough to justify capital punishment, but states that continued to practice capital punishment defended it as an appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes. Now let's discuss the role of legal challenges to execution methods and how these challenges shape the evolution of capital punishment in the modern era. As executions continued in the United States through the late 20th century, lawyers for condemned prisoners increasingly filed legal challenges arguing that specific execution methods violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. These challenges led to court cases and sometimes to changes in methods. Challenges to the electric chair were filed repeatedly. Lawyers argued that electrocution was inherently cruel, that it caused unnecessary suffering, that it was barbaric. In some cases, courts agreed that procedures needed to be improved, or that witnesses needed to be better informed. But in many cases, courts allowed the electric chair to continue. The Supreme Court never ruled the electric chair unconstitutional per se, though individual circuit courts sometimes limited its use. Over time, as states moved toward other methods, the electric chair was phased out. The last execution by electric chair in the United States occurred in 2003 in Virginia. Challenges to the gas chamber followed a similar pattern. Lawyers argued that cyanide asphyxiation was cruel, that witnesses reported suffering. Courts sometimes agreed that procedures needed refinement, but didn't necessarily rule the method unconstitutional. Over time, states moved away from the gas chamber. Some states maintained it as an alternative method but stopped using it. The last execution by gas chamber in the United States occurred in 1999 in Arizona. Lethal injection faced repeated legal challenges as well. Lawyers argued that the protocol wasn't followed correctly, that the anesthetic wasn't working, that the condemned were being subjected to painful drugs while appearing to sleep. These challenges led to stays of execution and to legal battles. Some cases reveal that prison staff executing people by lethal injection had no medical training, had missed veins, had failed to properly administer anesthesia. These problems strengthened the arguments of lawyers challenging the method. In some cases, courts ordered changes to the protocol. In others, courts allowed executions to proceed despite the problems. The legal battles over lethal injection continued into the 2010s and beyond. The development of life imprisonment as a permanent punishment that didn't require execution provided an alternative to capital punishment. A person sentenced to life without parole would spend the rest of their life in prison. They wouldn't be released. They wouldn't offend again. The goal of incapacitation would be achieved without execution. This made the practical argument for capital punishment weaker. Why was execution necessary if life imprisonment could achieve the same result? The only remaining arguments for capital punishment became philosophical or moral rather than practical. Did the condemned deserve to die? Should the state have the power to execute? Did execution serve justice or just retribution? As the 20th century progressed into the 21st, the number of countries practicing capital punishment declined. More and more countries abolished it. International human rights organizations campaigned against it. But some countries continued. The United States continued. China continued. Saudi Arabia continued. Japan continued. Iran continued. The countries that continued to practice capital punishment often defended it as part of their legal systems, as appropriate punishment for serious crimes. They resisted international pressure to abolish it. The global trend was toward abolition, but the trend wasn't universal. Let's now examine the economic costs of capital punishment and how this influenced policy discussions. Contrary to what many people assumed, capital punishment turned out to be very expensive. The costs of long appeals processes, of specialized legal representation, of maintaining death row facilities, of training and paying executioners, all added up. Studies in various states showed that capital cases cost significantly more than non-capital cases. The trial costs were higher. The appeals process was more extensive. The death row housing cost was significant. Some economists and policymakers began to question whether capital punishment was cost-effective. If the goal was punishment and incapacitation, couldn't it be achieved more cheaply through life imprisonment? This economic argument began to influence policy decisions in some places. Some states reduced capital punishment partly for budgetary reasons. The economic argument added to the moral and legal arguments against capital punishment. Let's discuss the role of DNA evidence in challenging capital punishment. Starting in the 1990s, DNA evidence became available as a tool for exonerating people who had been wrongly convicted. In some cases, DNA evidence proved that a person on death row was innocent. Other inmates could be identified through DNA as the actual perpetrator. These exonerations created a crisis in the capital punishment system in the United States. If innocent people could be executed, was the system reliable enough to justify capital punishment? Even people who supported capital punishment in principle began to question whether it should be used if there was a serious risk of executing innocent people. States that had executed people faced the possibility that they had executed innocent individuals. DNA exonerations led to moratoriums on capital punishment in some places. They led to re-examinations of death cases. They led to increased scrutiny of the legal process. By the early 2000s, concerns about wrongful convictions and wrongful executions were a major factor in debates about capital punishment in the United States. Let's now turn to a discussion of how different religions and ethical systems viewed capital punishment and execution methods. Christian theology had varied perspectives on capital punishment. Some Christian traditions viewed capital punishment as divinely sanctioned for serious crimes. The Old Testament contained laws calling for execution of various crimes, but the Christian teaching of forgiveness and redemption created tension with capital punishment. By the late 20th century, many Christian leaders and organizations opposed capital punishment. The Catholic Church came out against capital punishment. Many Protestant denominations opposed it. The shift reflected changing theological understanding about mercy, redemption, and the proper role of the state. But some conservative Christian traditions maintained support for capital punishment, viewing it as biblically justified and as appropriate punishment for serious crimes like murder. Islamic theology permitted capital punishment in certain cases. Islamic law prescribed execution for certain crimes. The methods prescribed included beheading, which was seen as quick and therefore acceptable. But Islamic theology also emphasized mercy and redemption. There was debate within Islamic communities about whether capital punishment was still appropriate in modern society. Some Muslim-majority countries maintained capital punishment as a central part of their legal systems. Others moved toward abolishing it or severely restricting its use. The differences reflected both theological interpretation and cultural and political factors. Buddhist and Hindu traditions generally opposed capital punishment. The principle of non-violence in Buddhism made capital punishment difficult to justify. Hinduism's concepts of karma and reincarnation suggested that punishment should aim toward rehabilitation and spiritual development rather than death. Countries with Buddhist or Hindu majorities often moved away from capital punishment or severely restricted its use. But these countries also sometimes maintained capital punishment in practice for the most serious crimes, creating tension between religious principles and legal systems. Jewish tradition had complex views on capital punishment. Jewish law, as codified in the Talmud and subsequent writings, permitted capital punishment in specific circumstances. But Jewish tradition also emphasized the extreme seriousness of taking human life. The procedural requirements for executing someone under Jewish law were so stringent that capital punishment became essentially impossible to carry out in practice. The principle was that taking human life, even as punishment, was such a grave matter that it should be made practically impossible. This reflected a profound ambivalence about capital punishment. It was theoretically permitted but practically eliminated through procedural requirements. Now let's discuss the role of media and public spectacle in the history of execution methods. Throughout history, execution was often a public event. In some periods and places, executions were major events that drew crowds. The publicity and spectacle served several purposes. It was supposed to deter others from committing crimes. It was supposed to reinforce state power. It was supposed to satisfy public interest in justice. But as time progressed, attitudes changed. The publicity and spectacle began to seem barbaric. As executions moved into prisons and became private events, media coverage took the place of public attendance. Reporters would witness executions and report what they saw. Newspapers would print stories about executions. Television would broadcast news about executions. The media became the conduit through which the public experienced executions. But media coverage also created opportunities for criticism. Reporters could describe suffering. They could describe botched executions. They could raise questions about whether the condemned had actually committed the crimes they were executed for. Media coverage both reinforced state justice and challenged it. In the late 20th century, as executions continued in the United States despite growing opposition, media coverage became more critical. Reporters began to ask tough questions. They interviewed death penalty opponents. They reported on miscarriages of justice. They described the experience of death row. They reported on failed execution attempts. This media coverage contributed to growing public concern about capital punishment. Some people who saw media reports of problematic executions reconsidered their support for capital punishment. let's discuss the role of international law and human rights frameworks in the evolution of capital punishment. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, didn't explicitly abolish capital punishment, but it emphasized the right to life. International human rights organizations interpreted this as opposing capital punishment. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, adopted in 1966, included a protocol calling for abolition of capital punishment. Over time, international frameworks increasingly opposed capital punishment. The European Convention on Human Rights explicitly prohibited capital punishment. This created pressure on countries to abolish it if they wanted to participate in international human rights frameworks. The European Union made abolition of capital punishment a condition for membership. Any country wanting to join the EU had to abolish capital punishment. This created a powerful incentive for countries in Eastern Europe and elsewhere to move toward abolition. As these countries abolished capital punishment to qualify for EU membership, the number of countries practicing capital punishment declined. This demonstrated how international frameworks and incentives could influence national policies on capital punishment. But international law had limits. Countries that weren't part of these frameworks, or countries that decided that international criticism was worth the cost of maintaining capital punishment, continued to practice it. China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and some other countries continued to execute people, despite international opposition. These countries viewed capital punishment as part of their sovereignty, as a decision to be made by their own legal and political systems, not by international frameworks. Let's now discuss specific regional variations in execution methods and attitudes toward capital punishment. In Southeast Asia, countries like Singapore and Thailand maintained capital punishment. Singapore used hanging for capital crimes. Thailand also used execution methods. These countries viewed capital punishment as appropriate for serious crimes and as part of their legal systems. International pressure to abolish capital punishment had limited effect. Singapore in particular maintained that capital punishment was necessary for social order and for deterrence. In South America, most countries moved away from capital punishment in the late 20th century. Some abolished it entirely. Others maintained it on the books but stopped using it. This reflected both legal reforms and changing cultural attitudes. The transition from authoritarian military regimes to democracies often included abolition of capital punishment as part of broader human rights reforms. Death penalty abolition became associated with democracy and human rights. In Africa, the situation was mixed. Some African countries abolished capital punishment. Others maintained it. Post-colonial African countries often inherited colonial legal systems, which sometimes included capital punishment. As these countries developed their own legal frameworks, some chose to maintain capital punishment, while others abolished it. South Africa's abolition of capital punishment after apartheid was particularly significant. It symbolized a break from the past and a commitment to human rights. The abolition came despite the serious crimes of the apartheid era, demonstrating a commitment to the principle that even for the worst crimes, execution wasn't the answer. Now let's discuss the development of anti-death penalty movements and how they influenced the abandonment of capital punishment in various countries. Death penalty abolition movements emerged in various countries at different times. In the 18th century Europe, Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria wrote against capital punishment. Beccaria's work influenced thinking about punishment and led to the abolition of capital punishment in various places. In the 19th century Europe, abolitionist movements grew. By the 20th century, abolitionist movements were active in many countries. These movements used moral arguments, practical arguments, and legal arguments to oppose capital punishment. Religious organizations often became involved in anti-death penalty work. Churches and religious leaders spoke out against capital punishment. Human rights organizations were founded to oppose capital punishment and to defend death row prisoners. Lawyers volunteered their time to work on death penalty cases. Activists campaigned against capital punishment. Over time, these movements helped shift public opinion in many places. Capital punishment began to seem outdated, barbaric, incompatible with human rights. Countries that had practiced capital punishment for centuries began to abolish it. The effectiveness of these movements varied. In Europe, they successfully led to abolition. In much of the world, capital punishment has been abolished or severely restricted. But in the United States, despite significant abolitionist activity, capital punishment continued through the 20th century and into the 21st. In China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other countries, anti-death penalty movements had limited effect on policy, but they did succeed in raising awareness and creating international pressure. They succeeded in portraying capital punishment as a human rights violation. Over time, the global trend has been toward abolition, even though pockets of capital punishment continue to exist. Let's discuss how capital punishment intersected with gender, race, and class throughout history. Throughout the history of capital punishment, these identity factors significantly influenced who was executed, how they were executed, and how their executions were treated. In many societies, women were sometimes treated differently than men in execution. They were sometimes given different methods. Some societies seemed reluctant to execute women. Others executed women readily. The treatment often reflected cultural attitudes about gender and about the seriousness of crimes committed by women. Race and class also significantly influenced capital punishment. In the United States, Black Americans have been executed at disproportionate rates. Poor people have been executed at higher rates than wealthy people. These disparities reflected broader inequalities in the legal system. Those with resources could afford better legal representation. Those without resources often received inadequate legal representation. Race and class disparities in capital punishment became a major focus of death penalty opponents. They argued that capital punishment, as it was actually implemented, was not applied fairly. It was applied in ways that reflected and amplified existing inequalities. This argument became increasingly persuasive as evidence accumulated showing the extent of these disparities. Now let's discuss the psychological impact of execution on those who carried it out. Executioners and people involved in executions experienced psychological effects. Some executioners reported guilt or distress about their work. Some became advocates against capital punishment later in life. Some remained conflicted about their role. Some seemed to have no significant psychological distress. The variation depended on the individual, their beliefs, their personality, and the circumstances of the executions they carried out. Albert Pierrepoint, mentioned earlier, eventually became a critic of capital punishment. After decades of carrying out executions as a professional, Pierrepoint came to believe that capital punishment was wrong. He expressed regret for the role he had played. His transformation reflected a broader shift in thinking about capital punishment. Even those directly involved in carrying it out sometimes came to question it. Prison officials involved in administering lethal injections also reported psychological distress. They were being asked to use medical knowledge and medical equipment to kill people. This created ethical conflicts. Some prison officials refused to participate in executions. Some reported psychological problems. The involvement of medical or quasi-medical personnel in executions raised ethical questions about the mixing of healing and killing, of medicine and execution. Let's now discuss how technology shaped the development of execution methods and how the evolution from simple methods to technological methods reflected changing attitudes. Early execution methods were simple and direct: a sword, a rope, a spear. These methods required skill and strength, but they didn't require much equipment. As societies developed technology, execution methods evolved to incorporate new technology. The guillotine used mechanical principles, the electric chair used electricity, the gas chamber used chemistry, lethal injection used pharmaceuticals. Each new method seemed more scientific, more technological, more distant from the violence of direct killing. This evolution reflected a changing relationship with violence. Direct violence seemed barbaric, but violence mediated through technology seemed more civilized. A sword executing someone seemed brutal. A machine executing someone seemed scientific. An injection executing someone seemed medical. The technology allowed society to maintain capital punishment while distancing itself from the reality of what was happening. The technology made execution seem less violent, even if the result was the same. This paradoxical relationship between technology and violence persisted through the 20th century and into the 21st. Now let's discuss the role of economics in execution methods. Different methods had different costs. Hanging required minimal infrastructure: a rope, a gallows, an executioner. The costs were low. The electric chair required electrical infrastructure, specialized equipment, trained technicians. The costs were higher. The gas chamber required specialized equipment and chemicals. The costs were higher still. lethal injection required access to specific drugs and medical personnel or personnel trained in medical procedures. The costs varied but could be substantial. Over time, states sometimes switched execution methods partly for economic reasons. A method that had become expensive might be abandoned in favour of a cheaper method. Concerns about the costs of capital punishment itself, including the entire appeals process, also influenced decisions about whether to maintain capital punishment. Let's discuss the specific case of China's use of lethal injection and the broader implications of this choice. China adopted lethal injection as an execution method and began using it in the 1990s. The method was seen as more modern and more scientific than firing squad. It was also seen as something that could be performed in a medical setting, rather than in a public space. This reflected China's modernization and its desire to be seen as a developed, progressive nation. But China's use of lethal injection also raised concerns. There were reports that executed prisoners' organs were sometimes harvested for transplant. This created a market incentive to execute people. It raised questions about whether the goal of capital punishment was being distorted by the transplant market. International organizations raised concerns about this practice, but China maintained that it was legal under Chinese law and that it didn't influence execution rates. Let's now discuss the role of religious execution in history and how it differs from secular execution. In many societies, especially during medieval times and into the Renaissance, execution was sometimes intertwined with religious practice. Heretics were sometimes burned at the stake in religious ceremonies. Religious law sometimes prescribed execution methods. The line between religious execution and secular execution was blurry. A heretic might be sentenced to death by religious authorities and then executed by secular authorities, or they might be executed in a religious ceremony. The religious framing made execution seem to have divine sanction. It was seen not just as punishment by human authorities, but as punishment sanctioned by God. As societies became more secular, this religious dimension fell away. Execution became purely secular, a function of the state's legal system rather than religious authorities. This change reflected broader secularization of society. By the 20th century, in most places, execution was a purely secular matter. Religious leaders might oppose it, but they didn't carry it out or sanction it directly. The move towards secular execution was associated with a move away from execution altogether in many societies. As religious justifications fell away, the moral justifications for capital punishment became weaker. Now let's consider the role of honor and dignity in execution methods. In many societies, how someone was executed reflected their status and dignity. Nobility might be executed by beheading, which was considered more dignified than other methods. A peasant might be hanged, drawn, or subjected to other methods. Even in death, social hierarchies were maintained. As societies became more egalitarian, this dimension changed. The guillotine treated everyone the same way. Lethal injection treated everyone the same way. This egalitarian approach to execution reflected changing values about equality. Everyone deserved the same treatment, even in death, regardless of their status. But this egalitarian execution also created its own problems. If execution was becoming more streamlined and efficient, more equal across classes, was it becoming more humane or just more normalized? Some argued that the machinery of execution was becoming routinized, that society was becoming comfortable with execution, that the efficient dispatch of prisoners by injection or other methods was making it easier for society to accept capital punishment. Others argued that egalitarian execution was more respectful than hierarchical execution, that it reflected human dignity and equality. Let's discuss the role of geography in execution methods. Different regions used different methods, partly based on what was available. Tropical regions might use different methods than temperate regions. Mountainous regions might use different methods than plains. Desert regions might use different methods. The available technology, the available executioners, the cultural traditions all varied by geography. Over time, as technology spread and as communication improved, methods became more standardized. By the 20th century, similar methods were used across regions, but local variations persisted. Some places maintained traditional methods longer than others. Some places adopted new methods quickly, while others resisted. Now let's examine the role of the state in developing and maintaining execution methods. The state had an interest in maintaining capital punishment as a tool of control and as a way of delivering justice for serious crimes. But the state also had an interest in maintaining legitimacy. If executions appeared cruel or unjust, public confidence in the state might erode. This created pressure on the state to develop execution methods that appeared humane and fair. The development of new execution methods often reflected this pressure. The guillotine was supposed to be humane and equal. The electric chair was supposed to be scientific and humane. Lethal injection was supposed to be medical and humane. The state invested in developing and refining these methods partly to maintain legitimacy. But as opposition to capital punishment grew, particularly in democratic societies, states faced pressure from the public and from activists to abolish capital punishment rather than improve execution methods. Some states responded to this pressure by abolishing capital punishment. Others tried to improve the methods while maintaining capital punishment. The tension between maintaining capital punishment and responding to opposition shaped the evolution of capital punishment in the late 20th century and into the 21st. Let's now discuss some of the most problematic executions in modern history, where the method failed or where the execution went badly wrong. These failures provide evidence for arguments that execution methods can't be made truly humane or reliable. In 1997, a lethal injection execution in Florida went wrong. The fourth lines were placed incorrectly. The chemicals were injected into soft tissue rather than into the vein. The person being executed appeared to suffer severe pain. The execution took over an hour. The procedure was visibly problematic. Witnesses reported that the condemned appeared to be in distress. The failure raised questions about lethal injection. If execution by injection could go wrong so visibly, what good was it? How could society justify this method? In 2006, an execution by lethal injection in Florida involved a similar problem. The fourth was placed incorrectly. The execution took over 2 hours. The condemned's body was visibly swollen from the misplaced injection. The execution was a disaster. Florida subsequently moved toward improving the protocol, but the damage to the method's credibility was done. Videos and reports of the failed execution circulated widely. In Arizona in 2014, an execution by lethal injection took nearly 2 hours. The execution was supposed to be quick and painless. Instead, it appeared that the condemned was conscious and suffering. The state had used a new drug combination that hadn't been tested extensively. The lack of expertise and the use of untested procedures led to a problematic execution. Arizona subsequently investigated the execution and considered changes to the protocol. These failures and many others like them provided evidence that lethal injection was not reliably producing quick, painless death. Death penalty opponents used these failures as ammunition in legal challenges and in efforts to create public opposition to capital punishment. The failures contributed to growing skepticism about whether any execution method could truly be humane. Let's now discuss the role of secrecy in execution. In early history, executions were often public spectacles. Everyone was supposed to see what happened to criminals, but over time, executions became more private. Fewer people were allowed to witness. Execution chambers were kept secure, procedures were kept secret. This secrecy made it harder for the public to know what actually happened during executions. It made it harder for critics to document problems, but it also meant that if executions went wrong, or if they appeared cruel, fewer people would know about it. The secrecy around executions reflected conflicting values. Societies wanted to maintain capital punishment, but didn't want to confront the reality of what that involved. By the late 20th century, some states had begun to make more information available. Some allowed media witnesses to executions. Some released reports about executions. Some allowed autopsy reports and other documents to be made public. This increased transparency sometimes revealed problems with execution methods, but it also provided evidence that execution could be carried out, sometimes without major visible problems. The transparency created opportunities for both advocates and opponents of capital punishment to use execution data to support their positions. Let's now turn to a discussion of the future of capital punishment and execution methods. By the early 21st century, the global trend was clearly toward abolition of capital punishment. Fewer countries practiced it. Fewer executions were taking place globally. But capital punishment persisted in several important countries, particularly China, which executed large numbers of people. The future of capital punishment likely depends on political and cultural changes in the countries that still practice it. In the United States, capital punishment seems likely to persist for the foreseeable future, but at lower levels. Some states continue to execute people. Others have abolished capital punishment or are moving toward abolition. Public opinion in the United States on capital punishment has declined but hasn't disappeared. As more DNA exonerations occur and as awareness of problems with the legal system grows, support for capital punishment will likely continue to decline. But complete abolition seems unlikely in the near term. In China, the future of capital punishment is uncertain. China has periodically indicated interest in reducing executions. But capital punishment remains an important tool for the Chinese government. Complete abolition seems unlikely. But there may be further restrictions on capital punishment or further evolution of execution methods. In the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran seem likely to continue capital punishment. These countries view capital punishment as central to their legal systems and as consistent with their religious law. International pressure has had limited effect. Unless there are major political or cultural changes, these countries will likely continue to execute people. Now let's discuss what the history of execution methods tells us about human civilization. The 3,000 years of execution methods we've examined show something complex. Humans have always had the capacity for violence. They've always had legal systems that permit execution of serious criminals. But the history also shows progress. Early execution methods were often designed to maximize suffering. Later execution methods were often designed to minimize suffering. The concern for making execution humane, even if ultimately doomed to failure, reflects a growing concern for human dignity and a growing understanding that death shouldn't be accompanied by unnecessary suffering. But the history also shows that technological progress doesn't necessarily lead to moral progress. More advanced societies didn't necessarily treat executions as more humane. Sometimes the opposite was true. Industrial societies that had advanced medicine and advanced psychology sometimes had execution methods that were no more humane than ancient methods. Sometimes technological sophistication was used to perfect the process of killing, to make it more reliable rather than more humane. The development of lethal injection, which uses medical knowledge to accomplish execution, is a case in point. Technology didn't prevent the continuation of capital punishment. In some ways, it enabled it by creating the appearance of modernity and humanity. The history also shows the power of social movements and international frameworks to change practices. The abolition of capital punishment in most of Europe and in many other places shows that societies can change their fundamental practices if there's sufficient political will and cultural shift. What was once considered normal and necessary can become considered barbaric and unnecessary. This gives hope to those who oppose capital punishment globally. If most of Europe could abolish it, perhaps other regions can as well. But it also shows that change is difficult and that powerful interests can resist it. The history of execution methods also shows the importance of moral leadership and of individuals who challenge established practices. People who opposed execution methods, who spoke out against them, who challenged them in courts, who built movements against them, all played roles in leading to change. Without these individuals and movements, change would have been much slower or might not have happened at all. This suggests that the future evolution of capital punishment will depend partly on the actions of activists, lawyers, religious leaders, and ordinary people who oppose capital punishment and work to change laws and attitudes. Let's now consider some final reflections on what the 3,000 years of execution methods tell us. The methods have changed dramatically, from simple violence to elaborate and prolonged suffering, to attempts at scientific precision and humanity. But one constant has remained. Humans have continued to execute other humans. The reasons have been consistent: serious crimes, political threats, religious differences, social control. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental practice has persisted. Perhaps the most significant development in recent centuries has been the growth of opposition to capital punishment. The idea that the state shouldn't execute people, that life imprisonment is sufficient, that capital punishment violates human rights, has grown from the thinking of a few enlightened thinkers to the policy of the vast majority of developed countries. This represents a fundamental shift in how societies think about justice, punishment, and the role of the state. Whether this shift will eventually lead to global abolition of capital punishment remains to be seen, but the trend is clear. The 3,000 years of execution methods we've examined show that human societies are capable of both great cruelty and significant moral progress. We've been capable of inventing methods to prolong suffering. We've also been capable of recognizing that suffering is wrong and working to reduce it. We've been capable of developing lethal injection and the guillotine, which were seen as humanitarian advances. We've also been capable of recognizing that these methods are still just methods of killing, and that the fundamental practice of execution is incompatible with human rights. The story of execution methods is not just a story of violence and cruelty, it's also a story of humanity struggling with difficult questions about justice, punishment, the role of the state, and the value of human life. The answers we've given to these questions have changed over time. The methods of execution have changed as a reflection of these changing answers. The future will likely bring further changes as societies continue to grapple with these fundamental questions. Now let's examine some lesser-known but historically significant execution methods that deserve attention. In medieval Scotland and England, the practice of being hung, drawn, and then burned was sometimes used for certain crimes. The condemned would be hanged briefly, taken down while still alive, have their organs removed and burned, and then be beheaded and quartered. It was a variation on drawing and quartering, particularly associated with crimes against the crown. The practice was both punishment and spectacle, a way of demonstrating the absolute power of the state over the condemned's body. In ancient Rome, one method not yet discussed was the Tarpeian Rock. Certain criminals were taken to the top of the Tarpeian Rock, a cliff overlooking Rome, and thrown off. The fall itself was the execution method. The rocky ground below often finished the job. This method was sometimes reserved for certain crimes, particularly for the worst enemies of the state. There was something almost poetic about it. The condemned were removed from Rome, flung into the sky, and left to fall. Death came from the height and the impact. It was violent and final. In ancient Persia and parts of the Islamic world, there was a method called burying alive. The condemned would be placed in a hole in the ground and buried, leaving only their head exposed. They would be left there until they died, which could take days. The psychological aspect was profound. The condemned could see the world but couldn't move. They were trapped beneath the earth, which was considered by many to be a particularly terrible fate. Some versions involved the burial being done partially or gradually, causing extended suffering. In some cultures, execution by exposure was used. The condemned would be taken to a remote location and left there, often tied to a post or rock, without food or water. Death would come from thirst, hunger, exposure to elements, or from predators. The exact timeline was unpredictable. Depending on weather and circumstances, death might come in days or in weeks. This method had the advantage of appearing to be natural. The state didn't technically kill the person. Nature did. The condemned were simply abandoned. But the effect was the same. Death was certain, just extended and uncertain in its timing. In the Byzantine Empire, there were specialized execution methods. One involved placing the condemned on a wheel and having them run over repeatedly by horses or carts. Another involved tying them between horses and having them torn apart. These methods reflected the Byzantine Empire's interest in theatrical and elaborate punishment. They were designed to be visible, memorable, and to inspire fear in potential criminals. In Viking and Norse societies, execution methods sometimes reflected cultural values. Drowning was sometimes used, being hung was sometimes used, but there were also methods unique to Norse culture. In some cases, the condemned would be placed in a wooden box filled with snakes or other creatures. The box would be sealed, and the condemned would die from bites and wounds. This reflected the Norse belief that such a death was a curse, that the condemned was being sent to a particularly terrible place in the afterlife. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, execution methods included sacrifice. The Aztecs practiced ritual execution as part of religious ceremonies. The condemned would be taken to the top of a pyramid and would have their heart removed. This was considered necessary for maintaining the cosmic order, for keeping the sun moving across the sky. From the Aztec perspective, it wasn't murder, it was a sacred necessity. But from the perspective of those being executed, it was death nonetheless, violent and sudden. In ancient Egypt, besides the methods mentioned earlier, there was also execution by being locked in a room with a crocodile. Crocodiles were considered sacred, and a person locked with one was being given over to the gods. The crocodile would attack, and the condemned would die from wounds and drowning. Like other animal execution methods, this had a sense of fate to it. The outcome depended on the crocodile's actions, which were seen as divine will. In medieval Japan, there were methods specific to Japanese culture. One was execution by snow. The condemned would be left in snow during winter without shelter or protection. Death would come from exposure and hypothermia. Another was execution by being left in a sealed cave or tomb. The condemned would be sealed inside with minimal food and water and left to die. Both methods had a sense of slow, patient death that reflected certain Buddhist and Shinto ideas about accepting one's fate. In some African cultures, execution sometimes involved public shaming combined with death. The condemned would be subjected to public ridicule, their crimes would be publicly announced, and then they would be executed. The public shaming was part of the punishment. It ensured that their crimes would be remembered by the community. Death alone wasn't sufficient. The memory had to be marked in the minds of the living. Let's discuss the role of lawyers and the legal system in shaping execution methods. As legal systems became more formalized, lawyers became involved in defending condemned prisoners and in challenging execution methods. In the modern era, particularly in the United States, capital cases became highly litigated. Lawyers would file appeals, challenge procedures, demand stays of execution. These legal battles sometimes resulted in changes to execution protocols. Sometimes they resulted in executions being delayed for years or decades. The legal system became a forum where questions about execution could be debated and challenged. This represented a significant change from earlier periods when execution was more arbitrary. A judge would sentence someone to death, and execution would follow relatively quickly. There was limited opportunity for legal challenge. But in modern legal systems, with appeals courts, with lawyers, with the possibility of presenting new evidence, execution became something that could be fought and delayed. This had consequences. Some condemned prisoners were on death row for decades. Some were eventually exonerated. Some had their sentences commuted. The legal system, for all its flaws, created a space where capital punishment could be questioned. Let's discuss the role of moral philosophers and ethicists in shaping attitudes toward execution. Throughout history, certain thinkers and philosophers challenged capital punishment. Cesare Beccaria in the 18th century argued that capital punishment was ineffective as a deterrent and that life imprisonment was a better alternative. His work influenced thinking in Europe and eventually in the United States. Other philosophers and ethicists built on these arguments. They questioned whether the state had the right to take life. They questioned whether execution served justice or just revenge. They questioned whether capital punishment was compatible with human dignity. By the 20th century, philosophers and ethicists were actively arguing against capital punishment. They wrote books and articles. They testified in courts. They advised lawmakers. Their arguments contributed to changing attitudes in many places. The idea that capital punishment might be wrong in principle, not just in practice, became more mainstream. This philosophical and ethical criticism of capital punishment was a major factor in its abolition in many countries. Let's discuss how media coverage of famous executions shaped public opinion. In the 20th century, as more media outlets existed, coverage of notable executions became widespread. The execution of a famous criminal or political prisoner could be covered in newspapers, on television, in films. The coverage influenced public opinion. Sometimes the coverage made the condemned seem sympathetic. Sometimes it made them seem like monsters. Sometimes it revealed problems with the legal system or with the execution method. Media coverage played a significant role in shaping public attitudes toward capital punishment. The execution of Ruth Snyder in 1928 by electric chair in New York was notable because a photographer snuck a camera into the execution chamber and photographed the moment of death. The photograph was published in newspapers. The image of the woman being executed shocked many people. The fact that it could be photographed, that her death could be documented visually, made execution seem more real and more troubling to many observers. The image contributed to growing concern about capital punishment. Let's discuss the development of death row itself as an institution. Death row wasn't always a thing. In many historical periods, condemned prisoners were held for short periods before execution. But as appeals processes developed and as cases took longer to resolve, condemned prisoners began to spend extended periods in prison. This led to the development of specialized housing for condemned prisoners. Death row became a place where people lived, sometimes for years or decades, knowing they would eventually be executed. The conditions on death row varied. Some were relatively humane, some were harsh. But the existence of death row meant that condemned prisoners had time to reflect on their situation, to appeal their convictions, to maintain contact with family and lawyers. The psychology of living on death row was significant. Condemned prisoners faced the certainty of their own death, combined with uncertainty about when it would happen. Some became deeply religious, some became activists, some became depressed, some went mad. The extended time on death row created a unique psychological situation. Some people argued that the psychological torment of living on death row was itself a form of cruel punishment. The expectation of death, sustained for years or decades, was psychologically devastating. Let's discuss the role of appeals courts in reviewing execution methods and sentences. As legal systems became more complex, appeals courts began to review capital cases and execution methods. Courts asked whether execution methods were cruel and unusual. Courts asked whether trials were fair. Courts asked whether condemned prisoners had adequate legal representation. These court reviews sometimes resulted in stays of execution, new trials, or commuted sentences. The appeals process meant that a single execution could take decades from initial conviction to final execution. This raised a question. Was the extended appeals process, the decades of living on death row, the repeated court reviews, cruel in themselves? Some death penalty opponents argued that it was. Others argued that the long appeals process was necessary to ensure that innocent people weren't executed. The tension between ensuring fairness and executing sentences remained throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st. Let's discuss the role of family members of both the condemned and the victims in capital punishment cases. Family members of victims often supported capital punishment for those who had harmed their loved ones. Executions sometimes occurred with family members of victims present to witness them. Some victims' families found closure in witnessing the execution. Others found no comfort in it. But their presence and their voices in capital cases influenced public perception of capital punishment. They represented the pain of the crime and the desire for justice. Family members of the condemned also played a role. Some supported capital punishment against their relatives. Some opposed it. Some maintained contact with the condemned through the years on death row. Some cut contact. The family dynamics around capital punishment were complex. The execution wasn't just an event involving the state and the condemned. It involved families, relationships, love, and pain. Let's discuss the role of religious leaders in capital punishment debates. As noted earlier, religious leaders had varying positions on capital punishment. Some supported it based on religious texts. Some opposed it based on religious principles of forgiveness and redemption. The involvement of religious leaders in these debates influenced public opinion. When the Pope came out against capital punishment, it influenced Catholic opinion in many countries. When Protestant denominations came out against capital punishment, it influenced Protestant opinion. Religious leaders had moral authority that influenced people's thinking about these issues. In some cases, religious leaders actively worked to prevent executions. They appealed to governors for clemency. They provided spiritual support to condemned prisoners. They worked with lawyers to challenge executions. The religious opposition to capital punishment was a factor in its abolition in many countries. It represented not just individual moral positions, but the organized opposition of major religious institutions. Let's discuss what we can learn from the history of execution methods about the nature of human societies. One lesson is that societies change slowly. Methods of punishment that had been used for centuries were abandoned relatively quickly once society decided they were barbaric. This suggests that practices we currently accept might seem barbaric to future generations. What we do today might be questioned tomorrow. This should make us humble about our current practices and more open to questioning whether they are truly just. Another lesson is that technology and progress don't automatically lead to moral improvement. The development of the electric chair, gas chamber, and lethal injection didn't make execution more humane. If anything, it made it easier for society to accept execution by making it seem more scientific and less violent. This suggests that we should be cautious about assuming that technological advancement will solve moral problems. We need to think carefully about what we're doing and why, regardless of how advanced the technology involved might be. Another lesson is that social movements and individual voices matter. The abolition of capital punishment in most of the world didn't happen because it was inevitable. It happened because people organized, spoke out, challenged the system, and worked for change. Without these efforts, capital punishment would likely still be widespread. This suggests that the future, like the past, will be shaped by the choices we make and the efforts we undertake. Let's discuss what the future might hold regarding capital punishment and execution methods. If capital punishment continues, it's likely that execution methods will continue to evolve. Some have speculated about new methods, some have speculated about returning to older methods, but the trend globally is toward abolition. As more countries abolish capital punishment, the countries that maintain it become increasingly isolated internationally. The moral and human rights arguments against capital punishment continue to grow stronger. The practical arguments for capital punishment continue to weaken. It's plausible that within another century capital punishment will be abolished globally, except perhaps in a few countries that continue to resist international pressure. If this happens, the history of execution methods will be complete. It will be the history of a practice that societies once thought was necessary and eventually abandoned. It will be a history that future generations will study as a curious relic of a less enlightened time. They may ask, as we ask about practices of the past, how societies could have executed people, how they could have thought it was just, how they could have refined the methods to make them more efficient. But they will also hopefully recognize the long struggle that led to the abolition of capital punishment, the efforts of activists and thinkers and religious leaders who challenged it. Let's now discuss some of the specific arguments that modern death penalty abolitionists make about execution methods. One argument is that no execution method can truly be humane. Any method that deliberately kills another person is inherently inhumane, regardless of how quick or painless it's supposed to be. This argument rejects the premise that execution can be made acceptable through technological improvement. It argues that the fundamental practice is wrong, not just the methods used to accomplish it. Another argument is that execution methods fail in practice. The electric chair has malfunctioned. The gas chamber has malfunctioned. Lethal injection has malfunctioned. These failures show that execution methods aren't reliable. If a state is going to execute someone, shouldn't the method be reliable? But reliability is difficult to achieve. Methods that are theoretically quick and painless sometimes go wrong. This creates the risk of prolonged suffering. Modern abolitionists argue that this risk is unacceptable. Another argument is that execution is irreversible. If a conviction is wrong, if an innocent person is executed, it can't be corrected. The person is dead. This irreversibility makes capital punishment uniquely dangerous compared to other punishments. A person wrongly convicted can be released from prison. A person wrongly executed is gone forever. Given the fallibility of the legal system, given the evidence of wrongful convictions, the risk of executing innocent people is real. Abolitionists argue that this risk is too great to justify capital punishment. Another argument is that capital punishment doesn't work as a deterrent. Studies have found little evidence that the existence of capital punishment prevents people from committing serious crimes. Criminals don't think rationally about legal consequences. The murder rate isn't lower in places with capital punishment than in places without it. If capital punishment doesn't serve its stated deterrent purpose, what justifies it? This argument suggests that capital punishment is maintained for reasons other than deterrence, reasons like retribution or public satisfaction, which abolitionists argue aren't sufficient justification. Another argument is that capital punishment is applied unequally. Poor people, people of colour and other marginalised groups are more likely to be sentenced to death than wealthy people, or members of majority groups. This inequality reflects broader inequalities in the legal system. If capital punishment is applied unequally, it violates principles of justice and fairness. Abolitionists argue that this inequality is inherent to how capital punishment is applied and can't be corrected without abolishing capital punishment altogether. Now let's discuss some of the arguments that modern death penalty retentionists make in favour of capital punishment. One argument is that capital punishment is an appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes, particularly murder. If someone deliberately takes another person's life, they forfeit their own right to live. The death penalty is the only punishment proportional to the crime of murder. This argument is based on a principle of proportional justice. The punishment should fit the crime. For the worst crime, the worst punishment. Another argument is that capital punishment serves justice for the victims and their families. When a murderer is executed, it provides closure and justice for those who lost loved ones. The victims' families sometimes feel that only the death of the murderer can provide adequate compensation for their loss. This argument is based on the needs and desires of victims' families rather than on abstract principles of justice. It recognizes that capital punishment serves emotional and psychological functions beyond the practical purposes of incapacitation. Another argument is that life imprisonment is itself a form of cruel punishment. Spending decades in prison is a long, slow form of dying. Some people argue that a quick execution is more humane than spending 50 years in prison. This argument accepts that capital punishment involves killing, but argues that it's preferable to the alternative of life imprisonment. Some death penalty retentionists argue that given a choice between a quick execution and decades in prison, many people would choose execution. Another argument is that capital punishment is a necessary deterrent for the most serious crimes and the most serious criminals. While studies haven't definitively shown that capital punishment deters crime, some people believe that it does serve some deterrent function. They argue that the risk of execution makes some potential murderers think twice. While this can't be proven definitively, it's plausible. Retentionists argue that we shouldn't abandon capital punishment without knowing for certain that it doesn't deter at least some people. Another argument is that capital punishment is an expression of community values and community justice. If a community votes to maintain capital punishment, if a jury votes to sentence someone to death, if a governor allows executions to proceed, they're expressing the community's judgment about justice. Retentionists argue that abolishing capital punishment against the will of communities that support it is undemocratic. They argue that the community has the right to decide what punishments are appropriate for serious crimes. These arguments continue to be made by death penalty retentionists in various countries. They reflect genuine moral and philosophical disagreements about capital punishment. Abolitionists and retentionists often talk past each other because they start from different moral premises. Abolitionists believe that the state shouldn't execute people under any circumstances. Retentionists believe that the state should have the power to execute people for the most serious crimes. These fundamental disagreements make it difficult to resolve the debate through rational argument alone. The debate is ultimately about values and beliefs, as much as it is about facts and logic. Now, as we approach the end of this historical journey, let's consider what the story of execution methods tells us about progress. Has humanity progressed? In some ways, clearly yes. We've abolished many of the most brutal execution methods. We've developed legal systems with appeals processes. We've created international frameworks that oppose capital punishment. We've moved from public spectacles to private executions. We've moved from methods designed to maximize suffering to methods that theoretically minimize suffering. By many measures, this is progress. But in other ways, the progress is more ambiguous. We still execute people. Some countries execute far more people than they did in the past. Some execution methods that are supposed to be humane still cause suffering. The legal system still applies capital punishment unequally. Innocent people are still at risk of execution. In many ways, we haven't progressed as far as we might like to think. We've made some improvements to a fundamentally problematic practice, but we haven't abandoned it. This ambiguous progress reflects a broader truth about human civilization. We make progress in some areas while regressing in others. We develop better technology while using it for worse purposes. We develop better ethical frameworks while applying them inconsistently. We believe in human rights while violating them. We believe in equality while practicing inequality. We're a mixed species, capable of both great goodness and great cruelty. The history of execution methods reflects this mixture. It shows our capacity for cruelty and our capacity for progress. It shows our capacity to refine brutal practices and our capacity to abandon them. Thank you for spending this time with us, for watching from wherever you are in the world, at whatever time it is where you are. We hope that this journey through 3,000 years of execution methods has given you something to think about, has challenged you to consider questions about justice and punishment, has perhaps made you reflect on how your own society approaches these questions and how you personally feel about the role of the state in matters of life and death. The history of execution is the history of our civilization. It's the history of how we've chosen to punish, how we've chosen to control, how we've chosen to express justice. Every execution method tells a story about the society that used it. Every abandoned method tells a story about how societies change. As you've been sitting with this history, you've been sitting with some of the darkest aspects of human civilization, but you've also been sitting with evidence of our capacity to change, to reform, to question practices we once thought were necessary. What we choose to do with this history is now in our hands. How we learn from it, how we shape our future based on it, how we treat those who have committed terrible crimes, how we define justice and punishment and the role of the state. All of these are decisions we must make. They're not easy decisions. They don't have obvious answers, but they're decisions we must grapple with. They're the kind of decisions that define us as individuals and as societies. Whether you support capital punishment or oppose it, this history should give you something to think about. If you support it, you should understand the full history of execution methods and consider whether modern methods truly represent an improvement. If you oppose it, you should recognize the challenges involved in abolishing such a deeply rooted practice. You should recognize that change comes slowly and that opposition to capital punishment faces powerful resistance from those who believe it serves important purposes.